Imagine waking up tomorrow morning to find that your smartphone is suddenly worth like $5,000.
Oh, yeah. Or your local hospital suddenly can't get replacement parts for its MRI machines.
Right. And the global automotive industry has just completely halted production.
Just stopped in its tracks.
Exactly. And the stock market is in this massive free fall that makes the 2008 financial crisis look like, a minor
That
correction.
anti-blip, yeah.
So you might assume it's a global economic collapse or a massive cyber attack, right? But the real cause. A fleet of cargo ships quietly dropped anchor about 100 miles off the coast of China, effectively shutting down the Taiwan Strait.
It's a scenario that fundamentally paralyzes the modern world.
Mhm.
And what makes it so chilling is that it doesn't require a single shot to be fired.
Not one.
Right. We constantly look for these dramatic explosive triggers in global conflicts, but the reality of the geopolitical pressure cooker in the Pacific is much more calculated. It's much more grinding, and honestly vastly more complex than a sudden explosion.
Which brings us to the exact reason we are here today. Welcome to you, the listener, to this deep dive.
Glad to have you with us.
Our mission today is to cut through those sensationalized headlines. You have probably seen them, right? The ones screaming about a countdown to World War III or a guaranteed invasion in the Pacific by 2027.
Oh, they are everywhere right now.
You really are. So we are going to strip all of that panic away and look at the actual complex and deeply fascinating dynamics surrounding Taiwan and China. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. And I think the best place to start is simply by grounding ourselves in the political reality of what we are actually talking about.
Right, getting the basics down.
Yeah.
One, brief overview.
Exactly. We are going to assume you already know the basic geography and the historical split of 1949. What we really need to examine is the deeply entrenched political stalemate that exists right now, today.
Right, because we are looking at two entirely incompatible realities. I mean, the daily practical reality for the 24 million people living in Taiwan is that they govern themselves. For our listeners, imagine an island about the size of the German state of Baden-Württemberg, right? And they have a vibrant free press, their own military, their own currency, and democratic elections.
By every practical metric, it functions as a state.
Exactly. But officially, the government in Taipei calls itself the Republic of China, or the ROC.
And across the strait, you have the People's Republic of China, the PRC, in Beijing.
Right, the mainland.
Yes. And to state the core conflict as, neutrally as possible, Beijing claims Taiwan as its sovereign territory. From their perspective, this is a settled question of history, and the Civil War never truly ended.
So they see it as unfinished business.
Exactly. They insist that unification must happen eventually. And crucially, they have never taken the use of military force off the table to achieve that goal.
But meanwhile, Taiwan entirely rejects that claim. They assert that the PRC has never actually ruled the island.
Right. Not for a single day.
So therefore, the future of Taiwan must be decided exclusively by its own citizens. So the rest of the world has to somehow navigate this.
And it is a very tricky navigation.
It really is. And the way countries like the United States and Germany handle it is through this masterpiece of diplomatic acrobatics known as the One China policy.
It really is a feat of linguistic engineering, honestly.
How so?
Well, in practice, the One China policy means that these countries formally recognize the People's Republic of China in Beijing as the sole legitimate government of China.
Okay.
They acknowledge Beijing's claim over Taiwan without explicitly endorsing it or recognizing Taiwan as an independent sovereign state.
I see.
Yet simultaneously, they maintain incredibly strong, quote-unquote, unofficial economic, cultural, and security ties with Taipei.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of agreeing to pretend the elephant isn't in the room, provided the elephant promises not to knock over the furniture.
That is a perfect way to put it. But recently, the elephant has been getting very restless.
Very restless. Which brings us to this warning marker that is everywhere right now, the year 2027.
Right, the famous 2027.
You literally cannot read an analysis of the Indo-Pacific without this year popping up. It sounds like a strict deadline for disaster. Where exactly does this date originate?
So the fixation on 2027 really gained momentum in 2021. The former commander of U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific, Admiral Philip Davidson, testified before the U.S. Senate.
Okay, a high-level military official.
Exactly. He warned that the threat of China making a military move against Taiwan was manifest during this decade, specifically within a 6-year window.
A 6-year window from 2021.
Right. And analysts quickly dubbed this the Davidson window.
And it wasn't just a military commander giving a rough estimate either. The intelligence community backed it up, didn't they?
They did. In 2023, the director of the CIA, William Burns, stated publicly that U.S. intelligence knew Chinese President Xi Jinping had ordered his military, the People's Liberation Army, to be ready to conduct a successful invasion of Taiwan by 2027.
Now, let me stop right there. Because if I hear, be ready to conduct a successful invasion by 2027, my brain translates that directly to war starts in 2027.
And that is exactly where we need to separate the capability from the intent.
Okay, unpack that for me.
If we look at the updated U.S. intelligence assessments from March of 2026, 2027 is a readiness milestone.
A milestone.
Yes, it is a capability threshold, not a guaranteed countdown clock. Having the tools to execute an operation is entirely different from making the political decision to actually launch it.
Let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. You are talking about the logistics of building a force, right? Building the specific landing craft, securing the command and control architecture, stockpiling the precision munitions.
Yes, exactly. All of that takes years.
Right.
The Chinese military is undergoing a massive, historic modernization effort. They want the option available to them by 2027.
The option, but not necessarily the mandate.
Exactly. Whether they actually execute depends on 1,000 variables. The health of the global economy, domestic political stability, the readiness of Taiwan's defense systems, and crucially, the perceived response of the United States.
So the timeline isn't a ticking bomb. It is a point on a graph where military capability theoretically intersects with political ambition.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But to understand what might actually happen if we hit that threshold, we really need to look backward at how we got here and what the people on the island actually want. Two notable cases.
Right, because the political landscape has shifted dramatically over the decades.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the historical roots after World War II, a civil war broke out in China, right? The communists won and established the PRC on the mainland, and the losers, the ROC, fled to Taiwan.
Exactly. And over the decades since, Taiwan transformed from a dictatorship into a highly vibrant democracy.
And for Beijing, bringing Taiwan under its control is viewed as finishing that civil war.
Yes, achieving what they called national rejuvenation by the PRC's 100th anniversary in 2049.
Right, but I was looking at the recent polling data coming out of Taipei, and the numbers are just staggering. Currently, less than 10% of Taiwanese people want eventual unification with the mainland.
And when you ask who wants immediate unification right now, it is only about 1%.
1%. Why is there such a massive, overwhelming rejection of Beijing's goal by the people who would be absorbed?
It really comes down to observing history in real time, specifically looking at Hong Kong.
The Hong Kong warning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For a long time, Beijing proposed a model for Taiwan called one country, two systems.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
The proposition was that Taiwan could rejoin China, but maintain its own democratic system, its capitalist economy, and its own way of life.
I mean, on paper, that sounds like a pragmatic compromise, right?
It does. But Taiwan watched what happened when Hong Kong was handed back to China under that exact same framework. They watched as Hong Kong's autonomy was systematically dismantled. They watched the implementation of the national security law, the crackdowns on protests.
Right, the protests were huge news.
And the overhauling of election laws to ensure only quote-unquote patriots could run for office, and the elimination of the free press.
So they saw the exact mechanics of how a promise of autonomy gets completely dismantled.
Precisely. Watching Hong Kong made the one country, two systems framework fundamentally toxic to the Taiwanese public.
Even to the people who might have wanted it before.
Yes. Even the political factions in Taiwan that have historically favored closer economic ties with the mainland recognize that the current electorate deeply distrusts Beijing's model of governance. They want to maintain their current self-governing status because the alternative they saw in Hong Kong is just unacceptable to them.
Okay, so we have established a deeply entrenched political stalemate. Beijing demands unification as a historical necessity, and the Taiwanese public overwhelmingly rejects it based on the Hong Kong precedent.
Right.
Which brings us to the actual scenarios. If political persuasion fails and that 2027 readiness milestone is reached, how does a conflict physically unfold?
That's the big question.
Because when most people think of this, they picture a Hollywood-style D-Day amphibious invasion. Thousands of ships, beach landings, massive casualties.
That is definitely the most traumatic scenario.
Yeah.
But military strategists emphasize that an amphibious invasion is not necessarily the most likely opening move,
Because it's so hard.
primarily because it is incredibly difficult to execute, yes.
Let's unpack why it's so difficult, because I think people really underestimate the sheer physics of crossing that strait.
They absolutely do.
Let's use a functional analogy here. A direct amphibious invasion is like trying to kick down a heavily fortified front door while crossing a moat. It's loud, it's highly dangerous, and it invites immediate police intervention.
That captures the logistical nightmare perfectly. The Taiwan Strait is notorious for its treacherous weather and tidal patterns. There are only 2 short weather windows a year where the waters are calm enough for a massive crossing.
Wow, only 2.
And furthermore, Taiwan's geography is basically a fortress. The east coast is characterized by sheer cliffs, and the west coast is composed of shallow mudflats.
So you can't just land anywhere.
Not at all. Military planners estimate there are only about 14 beaches on the entire island suitable for a major amphibious landing.
And I'm guessing the Taiwanese military knows exactly where those 14 beaches are.
Oh, absolutely. They have spent 70 years pre-sighting their artillery and mobile anti-ship missile batteries on those exact coordinates.
They are ready and waiting.
Exactly. A direct assault requires moving hundreds of thousands of troops, heavy armor, and logistics across 100 miles of open water.
Where you can be seen the whole time.
Right. Every single vessel can be tracked by satellite and targeted. Even if the PLA successfully lands, they have to secure a major port to bring in the heavy equipment, all while fighting uphill into dense, mountainous, urbanized terrain.
It sounds almost impossible.
The risk of failure is astronomically high, and a failed invasion could threaten the political survival of the ruling party in Beijing.
So, if kicking the front door down is too logistically risky, what is the alternative? This is where the concept of a blockade becomes terrifyingly relevant.
A blockade is vastly more likely than a dramatic invasion.
Going back to our analogy, if an invasion is kicking down the door, a blockade is like parking a truck across the driveway, turning off the house's water and power, and simply waiting for the people inside to starve and surrender.
And this isn't just a theoretical concept. We saw a very real rehearsal of this in December of 2025 with a massive Chinese military drill called Mission Justice 2025.
Let's get into the mechanics of that drill. What exactly did it look like?
Well, officially, it was framed as a defensive exercise against separatists. But global military analysts observed that the PLA was practicing the establishment of maritime exclusion zones.
Meaning keeping ships out.
Yes. They deployed warships to encircle the island, simulated the severing of undersea internet cables, and aggressively patrolled the airspace to choke off major shipping lanes.
They were basically practicing a quarantine of the island.
Exactly.
And why is a quarantine uniquely devastating for Taiwan?
Because of Taiwan's severe resource dependency. While it is a technological powerhouse, it lacks domestic natural resources. It imports nearly all of its energy.
Oh, I see.
Specifically, Taiwan relies heavily on liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to power its electrical grids.
And LNG isn't something you can easily stockpile for years, is it?
No, it requires massive, specialized, hyper-cooled storage tanks. Taiwan typically only holds about a 2-week reserve of LNG.
Only 2 weeks.
Right. If a blockade stops those specific cargo ships from docking, within a fortnight, the power grids fail. And you simply cannot manufacture advanced semiconductors without an immense, perfectly stable supply of electricity and water.
So the entire economy just stops.
Completely.
But what I find fascinating and honestly terrifying about the blockade strategy is how it weaponizes international law and economics. Because a blockade doesn't just stock ships with naval guns, it stops them with capitalism.
Yes.
If China declares the waters around Taiwan a military exclusion zone, global maritime insurance rates set by organizations like Lloyd's of London would instantly skyrocket.
That is a critical point. Commercial shipping companies operate on incredibly tight margins.
Yeah.
If the insurance premiums for sending a cargo ship into the Taiwan Strait suddenly cost more than the value of the cargo itself,
They just won't go.
exactly, the shipping companies will simply refuse to go.
The ships stop themselves. Beijing wouldn't even have to sink a commercial vessel. The sheer threat of it makes the insurance actuaries do the blockading for them.
It is brilliant in a dark way. It forces Taiwan to the negotiating table without the PLA having to risk a bloody beach landing.
That is the insidious nature of the blockade. However, there is a third, entirely different approach we need to examine. Instead of a slow economic strangulation, what about a surgical strike?
Right, what we refer to as a decapitation strategy.
This is the Venezuela 2.0 scenario. And the evidence for this is wild. I mean, satellite imagery revealed that China built an exact, true-to-scale replica of Taiwan's presidential palace and the surrounding government district in Taipei out in the remote deserts of Inner Mongolia.
Yes, the level of detail is extraordinary. Analysts assess that this facility is used to train special operations forces for highly targeted decapitation missions.
Walk me through the mechanics of a decapitation strike. How does that actually work in practice?
It relies on speed and absolute surprise. The scenario involves using massive electronic warfare to temporarily blind Taiwanese radar and communications.
Taking out their eyes and ears.
Right. And under that cover, elite airborne troops are deployed via high-speed stealth helicopters directly into the heart of Taipei. The objective isn't to occupy the city.
It's not about holding territory.
No, the objective is to capture or eliminate the key political and military leadership. The president, the cabinet, the top generals.
You basically cut the head off the snake so the body stops fighting?
Precisely. If the leadership is neutralized and the command and control network is severed, the regular military units are left without orders. Organized resistance potentially collapses before it can even mobilize.
And the comparison to Venezuela.
It draws a parallel to an event in early 2026 where the United States allegedly conducted a rapid operation to capture the president of Venezuela.
Oh, wow.
The strategic takeaway is that Beijing watched that unfold, and they might view a similar surgical strike as a highly efficient way to collapse resistance in Taiwan quickly, presenting the world with a fait-accompli done deal before the U.S. or its allies have time to react. 3. Current practices.
Okay, so we have the amphibious invasion, the economic blockade, and the decapitation strike. But here's the thing. As you dig into the mechanics of this standoff, you realize we don't have to wait for 2027 to see conflict.
No, not at all.
These aren't just hypothetical theories locked in a war room. Elements of this coercion are actively happening to Taiwan every single day right now. Let's look at the daily reality in the Taiwan Strait.
That daily reality is defined by a concept known as gray zone warfare.
Gray zone warfare. Explain the mechanics of this because it sounds like a buzzword, but the actual implementation is devastatingly practical.
It really is. Gray zone warfare is the application of intense, constant, multi-domain pressure that sits deliberately just below the threshold of an open shooting war.
So, annoying them, but not enough to trigger a real war.
The goal is to be aggressive enough to inflict real damage and exhaustion, but not quite explosive enough to trigger a formal military counterattack or draw in international intervention.
Let's talk about the specific domains. How is this actually manifesting?
It happens heavily in the cognitive and cyber domains. Taiwan experiences millions of cyber attacks every month, targeting government databases, hospitals, and critical infrastructure.
Millions. That's insane.
Yes. And then there is the cognitive warfare. Sophisticated disinformation campaigns deployed across social media platforms like Line, which is very popular in Taiwan.
Right.
They use deepfakes and algorithmic manipulation to amplify internal political divisions, spread panic about shortages, and erode trust in the democratic process.
It is literal psychological conditioning, but it's also highly physical, right? Let's talk about the airspace. In 2025, the incursions of Chinese fighter jets into Taiwan's airspace, their Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADA, rose by 23%.
Yes. You have heavily armed Chinese aircraft crossing the median line of the strait, flying incredibly close to Taiwanese sovereign airspace on a near-daily basis.
Just constantly poking the bear.
They deploy bombers, electronic warfare planes, and massive fleets of drones.
And the goal here isn't to start a dogfight. The goal is mechanical and economic exhaustion. Let's break down the math of scrambling a jet, because this is fascinating.
Go for it.
When a Chinese aircraft enters the ADI, the Taiwanese Air Force has to scramble their own F-16s to intercept and monitor, right?
Correct, and that is an incredibly asymmetrical cost. The Chinese military can use relatively cheap, expendable drones to trigger an alert.
Right, a cheap drone.
In response, Taiwan has to launch a highly complex, incredibly expensive fighter jet.
Exactly. An F-16 costs thousands of dollars per hour just in aviation fuel. But it's not just the fuel. For every single hour an F-16 is in the air, it requires dozens of hours of meticulous ground maintenance.
That really adds up.
You are burning through the lifespan of the airframe, you are wearing out the engines, and most importantly, you are physically and psychologically exhausting the pilots who are on constant high-alert rotations.
It is a war of attrition without bullets. It slowly degrades Taiwan's military readiness while simultaneously normalizing a highly threatening environment.
Just getting everyone used to the danger.
Exactly. It conditions the Taiwanese public and the international community to accept a massive Chinese military presence right on Taiwan's doorstep.
So how does a democratic society respond to that level of constant grinding pressure? I was looking at Taiwan's internal debate, specifically the legislative battles over their defense budget. The government holds civil defense classes for citizens, and President Le Ching-te proposed a massive $40 billion defense package.
Yes, the goal of that package was to heavily fortify the island, accelerating the shift toward what strategists call a porcupine strategy,
Porcupine strategy.
making the island so prickly and heavily armed with mobile missiles that it becomes indigestible to an attacker. Part of that budget included building an advanced air defense system modeled after Israel's Iron Dome.
But the opposition parties in the Taiwanese parliament actively blocked the package. Now, let me push back on this because it seems entirely counterintuitive to me. Wait, I'm confused.
How so?
If my neighbor is flying fighter jets over my house every single day and actively practicing blockading my driveway, buying a better alarm system isn't a provocation, it's common sense. How can the Taiwanese opposition logically argue that buying the Iron Dome triggers an attack?
To understand the opposition's argument impartially, you have to look at the mechanics of the security dilemma.
The security dilemma. Okay, what is that?
The security dilemma states that actions taken by a state to increase its own security, like buying a massive new missile defense system, can cause reactions from other states, which in turn leads to a decrease rather than an increase in the original state's security.
Ah, so it is the fear of crossing a red line before you are ready.
Precisely. The opposition argues that passing a sudden, massive $40 billion weapons package might be viewed by Beijing not as defense, but as preparation for a formal declaration of independence.
So they see it as unnecessarily provoking China.
They fear that heavily and rapidly arming the island could actually trigger Beijing to launch a preemptive strike before those defenses become operational. They argue for a more measured, less inflammatory approach to defense spending that doesn't provide Beijing with an excuse to escalate.
Okay, I see the logic. The ruling party argues that weakness invites aggression and only credible, heavily armed deterrence keeps the peace. The opposition argues that rapid militarization invites preemption.
Right. And it's important to note we aren't taking sides here.
No, of course not. We're just pointing out that this deep internal division is exactly what gray zone cognitive warfare seeks to exploit. If Beijing can keep Taiwan's politicians fighting each other over the budget, the defense systems don't get built.
That's the gray zone tactic working.
But Taiwan's internal debate is really only half the equation. We have to talk about the United States, Taiwan's biggest unofficial ally, and this fascinating concept of strategic ambiguity.
Strategic ambiguity is the cornerstone of U.S. policy in the region, rooted in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979.
Let's look closely at the text of that act because it is fascinatingly precise in its vagueness. It does not mandate that the U.S. military will defend Taiwan, right?
Correct. The act legally requires the United States to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character, ensuring Taiwan maintains a sufficient self-defense capability.
So it binds the U.S. to sell them weapons.
Right. But regarding direct military intervention, whether U.S. aircraft carriers would actually sail into the strait if China attacks, the official U.S. stance is deliberately ambiguous. They refuse to give a definitive yes or no.
Why would a superpower be deliberately vague about its red lines? Doesn't that invite miscalculation? Let's use an analogy to map the mechanics of this.
Sure.
Strategic ambiguity is like a tripwire in a pitch-black room. Let's say Taiwan is the homeowner, China is the potential intruder, and the U.S. is the local police force. How does this tripwire actually function as a deterrent?
The brilliance of the strategy lies in its dual deterrence. First, it deters the intruder, Beijing.
Hey.
China looks at the dark room. They know the U.S. has the most powerful military in the world, and they know there is a tripwire somewhere.
But they don't know where it is.
Right, because the U.S. refuses to say exactly what actions will trigger a massive alarm or military response. Beijing cannot calculate the exact cost of an attack. They don't know if a blockade triggers economic sanctions or if it triggers U.S. submarines sinking Chinese cruisers.
Because they cannot accurately model the risk, they are forced to act with extreme caution.
Exactly. It paralyzes the attacker with uncertainty.
But wait, it works in the other direction too, doesn't it? It deters the homeowner, Taipei.
Yes. Because Taiwan does not have an ironclad signed mutual defense treaty guaranteeing the U.S. cavalry will ride over the hill, they also cannot act recklessly.
I get it.
If Taiwan formally declared independence, which would instantly trigger a war, they don't know for certain if the police, the U.S., would actually show up to bail them out of crisis they started. This forces the homeowner to keep investing in their own locks and maintain the status quo.
It is an incredibly delicate equilibrium based entirely on calculated uncertainty. But looking at recent political developments, it feels like that uncertainty is shifting from a strategic tool into a genuine liability, particularly regarding U.S. domestic politics.
Yes, the Trump factor.
Right. There is a lot of focus on former U.S. President Donald Trump and his transactional approach to alliances.
The effectiveness of strategic ambiguity relies entirely on the underlying assumption of American reliability and global commitment. The Trump factor introduces massive turbulence into that assumption.
How so?
He has publicly demanded that Taiwan needs to pay more for its own defense, comparing the U.S. to an insurance company.
He is reframing the geopolitical alliance as a transactional business arrangement. If you want the protection of the insurance company, you have to pay the premium.
Exactly. And when you combine that rhetoric with the lack of a forceful U.S. response to China during that early 2026 Venezuela incident we mentioned earlier, elements within Taiwan are becoming profoundly nervous.
I bet.
There's a growing fear that a transactional U.S. leadership might calculate that defending a small island 8,000 miles away simply isn't worth the economic cost of a direct war with China. Or worse, that Taiwan could be used as a bargaining chip in a broader trade negotiation.
And this anxiety isn't just felt in Taipei, it is echoing back in Washington. 40 U.S. congressmen were so concerned about this perceived weakening of U.S. reliability that they wrote a formal letter to the Taiwanese parliament.
Yes, they explicitly urged the Taiwanese legislature to pass that $40 billion defense budget.
Yeah.
They're essentially communicating, you must demonstrate you're willing to bleed for your own defense because we cannot guarantee what the political winds in Washington will dictate tomorrow.
So the foundation of the deterrence is vibrating. But if we pull the camera back and expand the map, we realize that this isn't just a three-player game. It's not just U.S., China, Taiwan.
Absolutely not.
The regional web of alliances means a localized blockade could pull in global superpowers almost immediately.
Right. The most critical regional player is Japan. Geographically, Japan's southernmost islands, like Yonaguni, are just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan. But more importantly, the vast majority of Japan's energy and trade flows through the sea lanes surrounding Taiwan.
If the Taiwan Strait is blockaded, Japan's economy is instantly suffocated.
Exactly, which is why in late 2025, the Japanese Prime Minister made unprecedented statements indicating that Japan might actively intervene if conflict erupted. Japan recognizes that a successful invasion of Taiwan is an existential threat to its own national security.
And on the other side of the ledger, you have Russia publicly pledging unwavering support to China regarding its stance on Taiwan in February of 2026.
It's a powder keg.
It is wild. You start with a localized gray zone dispute over a political boundary, and within a single news cycle, you could have the United States, Japan, and Russia all drawn into a direct, kinetic military confrontation for future implications. Which brings us to the broader global implications. Because a listener sitting in Berlin or Chicago or London might still be thinking, okay, the geopolitics are tense, the military logistics are terrifying, but ultimately, why should I, the listener, care about a standoff thousands of miles away in the Pacific?
And the answer to that question comes down to Taiwan's most critical global asset, a concept called the Silicon Shield.
Let's dive deep into the mechanics of this.
The Silicon Shield refers to Taiwan's position as the undisputed, irreplaceable king of the global semiconductor industry.
And we must be precise here. We are not talking about the simple legacy chips that run your microwave or your washing machine.
No, we are talking about the bleeding-edge, microscopic, hyper-advanced semiconductors. Let's put some numbers to this. How dominant is Taiwan in this specific sector? Taiwan, specifically the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors.
90%.
These are the sub-5 nanometer chips required for global AI servers, advanced smartphones, autonomous vehicles, and next-generation military targeting systems.
90%. That is not a market share. That is a planetary chokehold.
It really is.
Now, let me stop and ask the obvious question. If these chips are the absolute lifeblood of the 21st century economy, why is it so incredibly difficult for Western countries like the US, Germany, the UK to simply spend $50 billion and build their own chip factories to replace Taiwan's output?
Because advanced semiconductor manufacturing is arguably the most complex physical process human beings have ever engineered.
Hmm.
You cannot just throw money at it and expect a factory in a year.
It's not just about building a warehouse.
Not at all. The fabrication plants, or fabs, require hyper-specialized clean rooms that are thousands of times cleaner than a surgical operating room. They rely on extreme ultraviolet, or EUV, lithography machines built by ASML in the Netherlands,
Okay.
which in turn use microscopic mirrors built by Zeiss in Germany that are so perfectly flat, if they were the size of the Earth, the tallest mountain would be a millimeter high.
Wow. It requires a global supply chain of absolute perfection.
Exactly. And beyond the machines, it requires decades of highly specialized, generational human capital. Engineers who understand the dark arts of chemical etching at an atomic level.
You can't just train someone to do that overnight.
No. If a fab in Taiwan experiences a power fluctuation for even 1/10 of a second, months of silicon wafers are ruined. Replicating that ecosystem takes decades.
So the theory of the silicon shield is that because the entire world, including China, desperately needs these chips to keep their economies functioning, the island is theoretically too valuable to bomb.
That's the theory.
But let me pose a critical question here. Let me push back hard on that premise. Does holding a monopoly on the world's most vital technology actually act as a silicon shield protecting Taiwan? Or does it just make the island a bigger target? Doesn't controlling the silicon make Taiwan a huge prize for a rising power?
That is the intense debate among strategists right now. If Beijing successfully controls the foundries in Hsinchu, they don't just control a geographic island. They hold unparalleled leverage over the entire global tech economy.
They could hold the world hostage.
They could dictate diplomatic and economic terms to Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo simply by threatening to turn off the tap of advanced chips.
Let's spell out the exact mechanics of what turning off the tap means. If the mission justice blockade scenario happens, China parks the ships, the maritime insurance spikes, and trade stops. What are the immediate economic shockwaves? Day one, week one.
The fallout would be faster and more severe than the supply chain crises we saw during the global pandemic.
Oh, wow. Worse than the pandemic.
Much worse. Modern manufacturing relies on just-in-time logistics. Automotive plants in Germany or the US do not hold a year's worth of microchips in a warehouse. They hold a few days' worth.
Right.
Within a week of a blockade, tech manufacturing worldwide would begin to halt. Assembly lines would shut down. Millions of workers would be furloughed globally.
An assembly line in Munich stops because a $5 component is stuck on a cargo ship in the Pacific.
Precisely. The prices for any existing consumer technology, medical equipment, or vehicles would instantly skyrocket, and the economic contagion would spread instantly. Beyond ships, a blockade would automatically trigger sweeping economic sanctions from the U.S. and its allies against China.
And sanctioning China is not like sanctioning a small, isolated rogue state. China is deeply integrated into every supply chain on Earth.
Right, and Beijing would absolutely retaliate. For Europe, and Germany specifically, the impact would be devastating. There are roughly 300 German companies heavily invested in operating right now in Taiwan.
300 companies.
Their assets would be frozen or destroyed. Furthermore, China could retaliate against Western sanctions by cutting off the export of rare earth metals.
Let's unpack rare earths because this is another critical vulnerability.
China overwhelmingly dominates the refining and processing of rare earth elements. These are the materials absolutely essential for building electric vehicle batteries, wind turbines, and advanced military gear like F-35 fighter jets.
So they could just cut us off.
An embargo on rare earths would cripple European automotive and green tech manufacturing almost overnight.
It is basically a scenario of mutually assured economic destruction. And yet, beneath the microchips and the cyber warfare, there is a deeply traditional, old-school geopolitical map element to this conflict. We have to talk about geography and the first island chain.
It all comes back to geography.
Why does geography still matter so much in an era of hypersonic missiles and AI?
Because geography dictates naval reality. If you look at a map of China's coastline, they are geographically boxed in by a string of land masses. This is the first island chain. It runs from Japan in the north, down through the Ryukyu Islands, through Taiwan, and into the Philippines.
Boxed in how? What is the physical limitation?
The waters off China's immediate coast are relatively shallow. to get their naval fleet, most importantly, their nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines, out into the deep open waters of the Pacific Ocean, where they can remain undetected and project global power, the Chinese Navy has to pass through the narrow geographic straits between these islands.
Ah, like the Bashi Channel.
Exactly.
And currently, those islands are controlled by U.S. allies or partners, meaning the U.S. and Japan have laid down sophisticated sonar arrays, like the SOSIS network, and can monitor every single submarine that tries to pass through those choke points.
Exactly. Taiwan sits dead center in the middle of this chain. It is the geographic cork in the bottle.
So if China takes control of Taiwan, they aren't just taking an island.
If they control Taiwan, the chain is broken, the cork is popped. China would gain unimpeded, unmonitored military access deep into the Pacific Ocean.
That changes everything.
It does. Their nuclear submarines could slide into deep water undetected. It would force the U.S. military to retreat thousands of miles backward toward Hawaii. Taking Taiwan would permanently alter the balance of global oceanic power in the 21st century. It is really about establishing regional hegemony.
Man, we have covered an immense amount of ground here. We've walked through the mechanics of the One China policy, dissected the logistics of amphibious assaults versus economic blockades, unpacked the daily exhaustion of gray zone warfare, and zoomed all the way out to the atomic complexities of the Silicon Shield and the grand strategy of the first island chain.
It is a staggering amount of interconnected vulnerability.
It really is. And understanding the mechanics behind the headlines is the only way to accurately assess the risk. And as with any deep dive, there are always layers beneath the surface that require further exploration. For you, the listener, if you want to keep pulling on this thread, I have identified 3 distinct knowledge gaps from our discussion today that are absolutely worth exploring on your own next.
Great idea.
First, dive into the actual science of extreme ultraviolet lithography. How exactly are these advanced semiconductors manufactured, and why is it so incredibly difficult for Western countries to simply build their own chip factories to replace Taiwan's output?
That rabbit hole is fascinating.
It really is. Second, if you are a history or law buff, go look up the specific historical treaties and documents that govern the One China policy in international law. The precise, calculated ambiguity of that diplomatic language is a masterclass in statecraft.
It's required reading for understanding this.
And third, look into the mechanics of global shipping. How do modern global shipping companies dynamically reroute supply chains when a major maritime choke point is suddenly closed off?
Those are excellent areas to investigate to truly grasp the unseen machinery of this geopolitical standoff. Outro.
So, as we bring this deep dive to a calm close, can you give us a final synthesis? Where do we stand right now, looking toward 2027 and the decade beyond?
The ultimate takeaway is that war in 2027 is not an absolute certainty.
That's a relief.
The military capability is being rapidly constructed, but the political intent remains fluid, constrained by massive logistical and economic risks. If a kinetic conflict does occur, a slow, strangling economic blockade is vastly more likely than a massive, dramatic invasion.
Right.
But most importantly, we do not have to wait for a formal war to see the conflict. The relentless daily gray zone pressure, the cyber attacks, the cognitive manipulation, the daily fighter jet incursions is already the reality for the 24 million people of Taiwan.
It's already happening.
Yes. The balance keeping the peace right now is incredibly fragile, and a miscalculation could instantly strain the global economy.
The pressure cooker is real, the heat is constant, and the valves are being tested every single day. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of the Indo-Pacific.
Thanks for having me.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to mull over, building on everything we have discussed regarding the Silicon Shield and global trade. We have spent decades optimizing the global economy for maximum efficiency, concentrating the production of our most vital, future-defining technology on a single, heavily contested island to keep costs low and innovation high.
We really have.
If global peace currently relies on almost every country needing the exact same tiny computer chips from the exact same small island, are we building a more unified, connected world, or have we just inadvertently built a more fragile one? Thanks for listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive.